The comments came after the Sarah Everard inquiry found Wayne Couzens should never have been a police officer. He killed the 33-year-old in South London in March 2021. Her family says she died because she would never have got into a stranger's car if he hadn't been a police officer. The inquiry chair, Lady Elise Angelini, warned without radical overhaul of policing practices and culture, there's nothing to stop another Couzens operating in plain sight. Hotels housing asylum seekers are costing the taxpayer £15 million a day, with Labour accusing the government of blowing its £1 billion budget. Treasury figures suggest the Home Office spent £4.3 billion more than budgeted on asylum accommodation last year. Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper says it demonstrates the complete chaos in the system. And it comes, as the latest figures show, illegal migration has fallen, but legal migration is up. The government data revealed small boat arrivals in the last year were down 36% on the previous year, which was a record year. However, more than 62,000 people were granted asylum in 2023. Excuse me, that's the highest level on record. The subject of assisted dying is a subject that must be addressed, with MPs warning the government that a plan is needed if laws are passed on Jersey or the Isle of Man first. Dame Esther Ranson is leading the calls for a discussion and possibly a referendum in the UK, saying the current legislation is a mess. She recently revealed she'd joined the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland after being diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. Hundreds of residents have been moved out of their homes in Aberdeen after they were found to contain dangerous crumbling concrete known as rock. Last year, schools and hospitals across the UK were partially and fully closed when they were identified as being at risk of collapse because of the concrete. Around 500 houses were found to be affected, and Aberdeen City Council is rehoming council tenants from about 300 properties. Now, tributes have been paid today for TV chef and Hairy Bikers star Dave Myers, who's died at the age of 66, less than 2 years after revealing his cancer diagnosis. Strictly Come Dancing star Karen Hauer has led the tributes to her former dance partner, calling him a dear friend. Countdown's Rachel Riley has remembered him as a great bloke and king. His partner, his motorcycling and cooking partner, revealed on social media that he'd passed away peacefully at home with his family. He said he couldn't put into words how he's feeling at the moment, but said everyone who loved Dave is devastated. That's the news for the very latest stories. Sign up for GB News Alerts, scan that QR code on your screen right now, or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
At 9:30 this morning, the Home Office published their migration statistics for last year. Before I go into the numbers, but suffice to say they are simply enormous, I want to think for a moment about the politics of this. You see, the Conservatives were elected to power in 2010, promising to reduce net migration to tens of thousands. They failed. But they made the same promise again in the 2015 manifesto. They're going to reduce net migration to tens of thousands. And they failed. And then, blow me down, in the 2017 manifesto, they promised they would reduce net migration to tens of thousands. And in 2019, they said they would take back control of immigration, with hints that numbers would come down. So we're in the 14th year of a Conservative government, and by any marker, whether it's legal migration or illegal migration, they have failed. And it's one of the reasons they're in so much trouble with their 2019 voters, especially those who've made the journey through UKIP, etc., from the Labour Party to the Conservatives, because for them, Brexit was about borders more than anything else. But don't worry, it's all OK. There's a new plan. Rishi's going to get tough. Oh, yes. Skilled workers to earn at least £38,000 a year, up from £26,000 a year. There'll be a ban on foreign workers in homes, bringing in family members, etc. A review of the graduate route for immigrants will be launched. And they're promising us now that this time, if we re-elect them, numbers will come down significantly. So let me ask you, do you believe Rishi Sunak? Farage at gbnews.com, or you can tweet #Farage on GB News. I don't believe a word of it. And to be honest with you, I don't think they ever believed a word of it. I think they're too far in hock to big employers in this country who want as much cheap Labour as possible. That's my view. Well, I'm joined by Dr. Mike Jones, Executive Director of Migration Watch UK, and Omar Hamoud Gallego, Fellow in Political Science and Public Policy at the LSE. Let's begin, shall we, Dr. Mike? Let's just look at the cold numbers.
Sure. Well, in terms of legal migration, the number of visas issued is around 1.4 million.
1.4 million.
So breaking this down, the number of people on the skilled worker visa is around 330,000. So that's about a 26% increase. The number of people on the health and care visa is around 150,000. So that's an increase of, 90%. Dependents are around 270,000. That's an increase of around 80%. The number of students is around 450,000. That's an increase of 70% compared to 2019. And then you've got a cohort of family visas, that's around 81,000. That's an increase of about 70%. And then you have smaller groups, on the BNO Hong Kong visa, the Ukraine resettlement program. But, it's increases across the board.
Yeah, I think many people would say, well, the Ukraine situation, the Hong Kong situation could be one-offs, and they could argue that. But I want to just hone in on something, the number of dependents. 270,000 dependents. And these are dependents of care workers. They say the rules are changing.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that politically the most explosive figure here?
Absolutely. I mean, restricting the number of dependents is low-hanging fruit because many of these people are economically inactive. So in terms of, looking at the Treasury and the fiscal impact of immigration, this is an obvious area to cut. So, banning certain groups of dependents for, say, postgraduate students or care workers, that's very much the most logical place to start.
Can someone explain to me why students brought dependents in?
They were mostly attached to postgraduates. So the composition...
So what, partners, perhaps?
Yeah, spouses, children, so on. And that took place essentially because the composition of the postgraduate student population changed. Historically, it's mostly been students from China, but Chinese students bring very few dependents with them. But we've seen a shift more towards, India and Nigeria, and the government has specifically targeted those national groups. And obviously, because of, cultural differences in family formation, they tend to bring more dependents with them. And obviously the student visas
does make you question the economic so-called benefits. One thing, though, we have to give them credit for is the figures show a 36% decrease in those crossing the English Channel. But I'm really sorry, Mr. Cleverly, you kept telling us in the last couple of months of last year that it was, because of government policy working. I kept saying the weather was rotten. You even said over Christmas, for the first time since 2018, nobody's arrived over Christmas. And I was Christmasing on the Kent coast and it was getting up to 50-mile-an-hour winds every day. The Home Office did say one of the reasons the numbers are down is the very bad weather in the last quarter of last year. So I hope, Mr. Cleverly, you withdraw those statements. Let's think about this, Omar, a bit more deeply. I sort of postulated at the beginning there that one of the reasons for this is the so-called insatiable shortage of labour, or more cynically, the demand of big employers to have a lot of cheap labour. Why have do you think the Conservatives have genuinely tried to get numbers down or not?
I think the Conservatives know that the economy needs these workers, right? So I think here's a clear point of disagreement. Many of the people that come here come because since Brexit happened, the migration system has changed, and now people that come because they have an offer from employers. The NHS now has over 100,000 vacancies. So the point is, we might want to reach an artificial target of 50,000, 10,000 migrants coming into the country, but many of these people come in because the economy needs them. Now, many of them not necessarily do jobs that some of them do the jobs that English people don't want to do, British people don't want to do.
That's the story. That's the story we're told. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But that could be about money, couldn't it? Because my observation going back to 2004 was that when you have a huge amount of foreign labour, particularly unskilled foreign labour, coming into the country, that the minimum wage becomes the maximum wage, and that means the difference between being on benefits and working is pretty marginal for British nationals.
But the issue is that many of them, I mean, if we wanted to increase, let's say, the salaries of care workers, of NHS staff, to get more British people working into these sectors, we could do this, but that would increase the bills, of course, for British nationals. So there's a trade-off here. We can get people that are clearly qualified, that do the jobs that we need, and effectively, especially in the NHS, if we don't get these people now, before we train nurses and doctors and all of that, that will take several years.
The lack of skills, there is a time lag. I've been saying this for 20 years. Why is everybody doing social sciences when we need nurses, engineers, and they've been shortages for a long, long time? No, I fully understand that point. But you know something? When Tony Blair came to office, we had 58 million people. We've now got 68 million people. That's going to be 75 million people by 2036 on current projections. And actually, and we can argue whether GDP goes up by 0.1% a year, and we can argue that we might be short of baristas or whatever it may be. But actually, the impact of a population explosion on the lives of ordinary people is now being seen to turn negative, isn't it?
Well, I would disagree with that. I think when we know very well, I mean, the economics speak very clearly. You know, when people come in, migrants are younger. They are many of them are highly skilled. When the economy needs them, they contribute. They are less likely to use social services like the NHS, the schools, etc.
But they need houses.
Of course,
they need places to live.
Absolutely, they do. But we also need that. And the fact is that the government hasn't produced them neither for them nor for us, right? And that's the big issue. You can't blame migrants for something that actually is the government's fault for many years, decades.
If public policy can't anticipate how many are coming, it's difficult to know what to build.
But it's not a problem of public policy per se, it's a political issue. It's the issue that there's so much NIMBYism in this country that effectively we're not increasing the supply of housing as we need.
I believe the social side of this has been negative, firmly, but that's a subjective comment. On the more objective economic point, you know, Mike, and I can remember, you know, arguing this with the BBC's Nick Robinson 10 years ago, you know, that he's, oh, well, you know, GDP goes up by 0.1% a year, but then GDP per capita actually isn't going up. In fact, it's going down. Is there now a case that can be made that mass migration on this scale is not an economic benefit?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the case has been there for decades. There's a difference between growing the economic pie. If you increase the size of the population, obviously you're going to increase the size of GDP, which is, you know, the total number of goods and services. But real wealth is created through GDP per capita, which is per person. And there are many smaller countries with smallish populations that are wealthier than the UK or wealthier than countries with larger populations, you know, Singapore, Norway, Switzerland. So ultimately, it's about human capital, skills, competence, and investment in the capital stock. So it's about the quality of your population rather than sheer quantity. And there are actually, you know, what they call externalities in terms of having a higher population. You mentioned the pressure on housing.
Roads, housing,
infrastructure,
health, education.
And social capital.
Education's a big one, of course, because a lot of people who come are younger, have quite big families. I mean, look, we may have a Labour government in a few months' time. Who's to say? I mean, they're looking at a sort of returns deal with the EU that could even increase numbers. I mean, are we just going to go on, do you think, with our population exponentially growing?
The amount of migrants coming in is not so much the issue, I think. The issue is how do we give a sense to citizens that effectively the numbers, that the borders are controlled and that the numbers are, if you want, part of a bigger plan or a long-term plan. And I don't see the issue. I don't agree with the fact that, you know, the population is increasing because of migrants, and that is necessarily a bad thing.
It is. I mean,
think of countries such as Canada. Think of Australia.
Well, they've got rather more room than we have. But if you what is a fact is that 85% of the 10 million growth since 1997 is directly down to migration and migrants having children. That's a fact. Whether it's good or bad is the thing we can argue about. But what is interesting, you know, is that David Neil, who was recently sacked by the Home Secretary, his papers have been published over the course of the last hour. You know, and he says our border protection, this is on illegal immigration, our border protection is neither effective nor is it efficient. He says all the recommendations he's made haven't been listened to. I mean, that's one area. That's one area. Illegal immigration, the British public overwhelmingly are demanding their politicians do something. Why don't they?
Well, the fact is that, first of all, just to make clear, the amount of people coming in by boat is an extremely small amount compared to the overall migration numbers, right? So last year, around 36,000 people came in by boat, which is, compared to the million and some and more than have come, of course, it's a very small percentage.
But it's very visible.
It is a very visible one because politicians want to make it visible. But that's another issue.
No. They want to hide it. I made it visible.
Yeah, I was talking about you. But the issue is rather, if you look at the data, the latest Home Office data show that 2/3 of the ones that have come and applied for asylum have actually been accepted.
Which is truly extraordinary.
Extraordinary, right?
How on earth that's
it
happened?
means that effectively many of them are genuine refugees.
Well,
and so the question is,
we've been
how can
granting asylum to Albanians when France and Germany give zero. I mean,
But Albania is a different case, and now there is a clear agreement. There is a return agreement with Albania because effectively it's a safe country.
If you can't return people to other parts of the world, it seems to me they've taken the view, just let them stay. I'm going to give a final word on this good debate to Mike. Illegal immigration, promise after promise after promise. Rhetoric being upped and upped. Home secretaries, I'm putting the Royal Navy in the Channel. Not much is changing, is it?
No, the numbers have come down slightly, but that's due to the returns policy that Rishi Sunak has with Albania.
Yeah, now, and the weather.
And the weather.
Yeah.
But the most fundamental question in illegal migration policy is this. If somebody arrives in your territory illegally, can you deport them to their country of origin or a third safe country like Rwanda? In many cases, we can't do that. You look at the top 3 nationalities of people coming to the UK via small boats, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey. Rishi Sunak thrashed out a returns policy with the Turkish government, but what happened?
It doesn't seem to be working. Do you know what, folks? We could discuss this forever. The numbers are the numbers. They can't be disputed. They show some massive increases year on year, despite all the promises. I don't think this government's going to get rid of it. I don't think the next government is going to get rid of it either. And I think overall, I think it's a negative. It is a great debate. Next Wednesday, Jeremy Hunt's budget. It'll be the last budget before the general election. And the talk now is he's going to change his tax policy on non-doms to mirror that of the Labour Party. Is that really what a Conservative Chancellor should be doing, or is he just playing politics?
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
We have let Islamist extremism into Britain, we've let it fester, and now we've let it win. Our absolutely spineless surrender merchant political top brass are rolling over while government ministers wear stab vests and quit their jobs in fear. Veteran Tory Minister Mike Freer has had death threats from Islamists as well as an alleged arson attack on his office. The motive there has still not been established. He's standing down because he doesn't want to die. I cannot emphasise how important this is. A minister of the government is quitting his job because he doesn't want to be killed by a lunatic jihadi. And our Prime Minister has said absolutely nothing. Nothing. A spokesman for Rishi Sunak said he was saddened. Is that it? Our Prime Minister should have been out on the steps of Downing Street saying that we will not be intimidated. We will not let this continue. Enough is enough. What does he do instead? He tweets about XL bullies. Yeah, fantastic. Where's Keir Starmer on this? Well, he's conducting focus groups on how to get the Muslim vote back, so he's hardly going to come out all guns blazing, is he? Ed Davey? Well, there's no way a Liberal Democrat leader would come out and admit that his ideology has helped turn Britain into a poster nation for multicultural failure. The police have let protesters, which include rabid anti-Semites, rampage around London every flipping Saturday for the last 3 months. And today, they are finally saying that they don't support some of the protests, which in the past have included a now banned terror group and people holding up anti-Jewish signs. They're saying, please don't march down Whitehall. All right, but will you do anything to stop them if they ignore you? I doubt it. I honestly cannot believe that we have sunk to the level where a serving minister stands down because of threats from extremists and our Prime Minister just doesn't feel the need to address it.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So your reactions, I asked you, do you believe Rishi Sunak when he says, whatever's happened in the last 14 years, we have a new set of policies, we're going to sort the whole thing out? John says, do I trust Rishi Sunak? Not as far as I could throw him. Heidi says, I now think we need an election ASAP. Sunak and the Conservative Party are over. The longer they're in power, the more damage they'll do to the country. Michael said, no, he'll never get a grip on it. And Derek says, no one believes the government on this. They are helpless, as will be Labour. Yes. Interesting, isn't it? This huge national debate on immigration, an issue that's has risen, right up to be one of the top 2 or 3 policies, issues that people care about. And the Labour Party offering almost no alternative whatsoever. Now, it's the budget next week. And I'm joined by James Price, former Treasury Special Advisor and Director of Government Relations at the Adam Smith Institute. James, one of the things that the Labour Party have been saying consistently, one of the pieces of clear blue water, at least on this area, if not the previous subject, is they're going to tax non-doms, and that'll raise £3.6 billion a year. In a simple sentence, tell our audience, what is a non-dom?
So this is the idea that people who live in the United Kingdom and that they're considered to live here for tax purposes, nevertheless don't pay tax on anything that they have abroad, basically. So the idea is for this policy...
So they're foreigners?
That's right. And they can be foreigners and they can be from here, but they can say, actually, no, I've got other things over there, and they consider themselves as being non-dom for these purposes. And so the idea is that you have an incentive scheme like this to attract wealthy people to come and live in the United Kingdom, to invest here, to put down their family roots here, and all these sorts of wonderful things that they can then invest in and all the rest of it. And so you get the purposes of their family businesses maybe being based here. You can then tax what they do here, and that will go and pay for schools and hospitals. But they're not afraid that the British taxman is going to go after anything that they've got around the world.
Their other global earnings. And, of course, the Prime Minister's wife, perhaps being the most famous non-dom estate as she has now, changed. But the idea that they'll raise an extra £3.6 billion by change... I'm told that all these people would then need to do is to put their offshore earnings into a trust and obviate all of it.
Right, and this is the problem, that the tax code is so incredibly complicated. 30 years ago, it was maybe this big in a book. Now it's probably this big or something. Thousands and thousands of pages, lots of loopholes, and if you've got enough money, you can hide it wherever you want. And it means normal people who can't do those sorts of things, you can't pay for fancy accountants and all the rest of it, you get stung with higher tax bills. So what would actually be great is to have a simple tax system. You could do away with lots of these things, ideally. And actually, in lots of cases, you then get more tax money coming in.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same Jeremy Hunt who said last year, we want rich foreigners living in Britain spending loads of money here. Well, I kind of agree with that. He's doing this for political purposes, isn't he?
Right, so Labour at the moment, as far as I can count, they've got this and they've got schools. The VAT on private schools, right, which is also a terrible idea. They've got 2 policies left, and I guess the political machination here is if the Tories come out and do this, then Labour have only 1 policy left, and I'm pretty sure that soon we'll get rid of that one as well.
Now, budgets are nearly always flagged these days. There are no great surprises, and it was perhaps one of the reasons why the Kwarteng Trust budget caused such chaos. They hadn't trailed any of it. The markets went after them. The Bank of England didn't help too much either. But this one's being trailed in classic style. So National Insurance is going to get a 1% cut. That's pretty much nailed on. And that's going to allow them to say, we're cutting your taxes. But that wouldn't be true, would it?
Well, they're cutting that tax in that respect, and sometimes it has to go up in other areas, and that this is the problem. If you try and play these accountancy rules, it depends on where you forecast these things out, how long it goes, whether it's a tax-cutting budget, a tax-raising budget. It all depends where these things kind of fall. And it sounds a little bit to most people like accountancy jiggery-pokery.
Overall, the tax burden's risen.
Right, and it's at the highest level it's been since after the end of the Second World War. And I think part of the problem is, and I'm maybe giving some of the game away here, that Treasury brain, as it's sometimes known, is this idea that a tax cut will cost something, and that's a sort of static idea. So we do this tax and it brings in this much money. What you don't then do is see all the other secondary effects that come along. So take something that the Adam Smith Institute wants to do is to abolish inheritance tax entirely. The moment inheritance tax as a headline figure brings in something like £7 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, but then if you look at all the other distortionary effects that happen, so the idea that people will hide their money away, they'll sell off businesses before they die, they'll move it into other areas that aren't as efficient, don't raise as much money, that £7 billion actually, if you worked it out, would go a lot lower. Maybe it would even be negative, because this idea that if you lower tax rates, people stop hiding money in other areas, they start actually paying more tax, you've got more money for schools and hospitals.
That did happen way back in the 80s.
Absolutely.
But one of the genius ideas that Jeremy Hunt's got, and I can't believe this, because in 2008 we had a global credit crunch caused by people over-borrowing on properties. He wants to introduce, and I can't believe this, 99% mortgages. Have we learned nothing?
Well, I hope that this is one of these, they call it a kite-flying exercise. You put this up there and see how people react to it. I hope that this is somebody putting this out here so that this idea will just go away. So you see, it's caused all kinds of problems, and messing around with demand for housing is not the way to do it. Unfortunately, we're going to have to bite the bullet and build an awful lot more houses. That would solve all kinds of problems. The problem is that some people don't like that. They don't want new houses built in their backyard. But actually, if you built beautiful houses, by the way, people would love it. If you had another city of Bath somewhere that would look even nicer than a plain green field.
Yeah, they might be quite expensive houses, though.
They could be, but if you build enough of them, it brings the cost down everywhere for everybody.
No more money for defence, that's been flagged already, which seems pretty astonishing.
Absolutely mad.
Given the global situation, and given that our American friends are saying, are you guys really seriously good allies anymore? Are you the bridge in NATO to the other members? Overall, what do you expect this budget to be?
I think it's going to be sort of small p political if they do go ahead with this non-dom thing, that is shooting the Labour fox, to use one of those awful kind of cliches. I think it'll be steady as she goes because the outlook is bad. And to be fair to the Chancellor, he doesn't have an awful lot of space to manoeuvre. This Office for Budget Responsibility that George Osborne put in, a good idea, in theory, that people would give a sort of mark your homework on these things. The way that it works these things out, it really constrains the action that the Chancellor can do. We saw that with that mini-budget. The reason it was a mini-budget was because they didn't put it to the OBR, as it's known, and we saw the problems that happened there. But there are certain things that it always scores well, immigration, to use the last thing here, and not other things as well, because there isn't the evidence base for it. So the Chancellor's not got an awful lot of movement that he can do. I suspect there may be one more budget that comes just before the election to signpost what could happen the Tories next.
You may be right. You may be right. And I hear people saying, oh, no, not another one already. Thank you very much indeed, James. And being GB News, we want to know what you think of this budget next Wednesday. So I will be up on the Cumbrian coast next week. I'll be there. Michelle Dewberry will be there. We're going to be in the Cumbrian seaside town of Whitehaven. So you know the drill. If you don't get in quickly, the auditorium will be full. In fact, I predict it'll be full by breakfast time tomorrow morning. Go to gbnews.com, go to the website, get the QR code. If you want to come, the QR code's there on your camera now. If you want to come along to our budget special, and we want to get the reaction of people a long way from the centre of London to the budget. So move very quickly, and I'll see you there next week. In a moment, Joe Biden has been declared officially, medically fit to run for president. I know you really couldn't make it up, but that is what has happened. We'll debate that, we'll debate Trump and NATO and much more in just a moment.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Welcome to the show. Superb stuff, great footage. So you're right in the thick of it there. What's the mood on the ground?
Well, I've left there now. I've actually now come to that EU Council summit that I was talking about. It's still pretty chaotic. The entire city of Brussels has been completely clogged with these tractors sort of 3 abreast in most of the roads across the city. The people of Brussels aren't particularly happy. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent for some people of the Just Stop Oil protests, people gluing themselves. People are unable to get to hospital appointments, and there's a lot of upset about the destruction that's happening on the streets of Brussels today. But on the other side, there's also the protests, which the farmers are saying that EU green laws simply are not able to fit with what they need to do to keep their businesses going. And just before the protests happened, we saw the European Commission actually make some concessions to the farmers' protests. And this is on the demands that were put on them to set aside somewhere in the region of 5% of their land for regrowing for biodiversity. A lot of the farmers have said that's not possible, and the European Commission has said that they can delay that coming in. So they have won a small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures, endless red tape. As Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain, they've simply had enough, and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So let's work this out, shall we? The American president, 81-year-old Joe Biden. You know the guy who often doesn't look like he knows what day of the week it is, walks in the wrong direction, falls over on stages, slips down steps coming out of aeroplanes, and generally all round is a bit of an embarrassment for America. At least I would have thought that. And that was very much confirmed by the special prosecutor the other day, saying that he was an elderly man with a poor memory. Well, you could knock me down with a feather, because he's had his annual health summary that has been released by the White House, and the docs have said he's a healthy, robust 81-year-old, and he can successfully execute the duties of the presidency, including being commander-in-chief. Worth noting, though, that was the physical examination. He refused to take a cognitive test. Well, I'm joined by Eric Prince, businessman, former US Navy SEAL officer, founder of Blackwater and conservative. Eric, forgive me. We love America, really, but when we look at this, we say to ourselves, how is any of this credible? What the hell's going on?
If they didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards. I wonder if the pilot of Air Force One could also refuse a cognitive test.
Yeah, well, quite. No, I mean, it is, arguably the most important job in the world. But, I mean, what's interesting, of course, is that voters overwhelmingly, including many Democrats, think the guy is simply too old.
Yeah, the emperor has no clothes. And it's becoming increasingly obvious, and it's embarrassing. And unfortunately, the enemies of Western civilization see the weakness, and they're making the most of it over the next 10, 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think the withdrawal of the last few troops in Afghanistan, they were purely there for training purposes. That was the moment, wasn't it, really, that the world started to go wrong?
They didn't listen to any of the warnings, and they really believed their own Beltway nonsense bubble, and the enemy always gets a vote, and they fed it to them.
Well,
at the end of a bayonet.
I know that Donald Trump, and I met him at the weekend, I know that he would love Biden to be the candidate. Biden is the ideal Democrat to face in November. They're going to ditch him, aren't they, Eric?
It's not as easy as it sounds.
Go on.
Because they'd have to invoke the 25th Amendment.
To say that he's mentally...
To say that he's actually mentally incapacitated, which effectively this prosecutor has said, I'm not going to prosecute him because if his defense would be, he's a senile old man. That's what the federal prosecutor just said. But to remove him from the candidacy, they have to invoke the 25th Amendment, which I can't see the Democrats doing. And so they'd have to convince him somehow at the convention to let them swap. Now, the Democrats changed their rules so they can do a last-minute switch at their convention, which is in August. But absent that, he will be the candidate for president.
Quite extraordinary. Now, Donald Trump gave a big speech about NATO the other week and said, look, guys, you know, if you don't pay, we're not going to protect you. How do you assess the mood of America towards its NATO involvement? Is it much weaker than it was?
It's absolute fatigue. I think you still have well over half of NATO countries not spending anywhere near the 2%. That's been generally agreed to for the last 70 years, and they're just not doing it. And so I think Americans, as we're $34 trillion in debt, they're sick of the free rider, freeloading aspect to it. I mean, Norway spends 1.5%, and they have a website showing their national sovereign wealth fund, which is north of $1 trillion now. And so there's a disconnect. Why do American taxpayers have to pay when Norway is not willing to? Or Germany, even worse.
Oh, they've been paying about 1% for many, many years, and Ireland almost nothing.
The overall readiness of all their militaries is really pathetic. And so is NATO an alliance, or is it a protectorate? The era of protectorate is ending.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is very, very interesting. I mean, we kind of protect Ireland on this stuff, and in the same way we hope America is going to protect us. Do you think, and, you know, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO, actually supports what Trump is trying to do. You know, he wants those member states to start spending money, and there is what's going on the doorstep in Ukraine. Do you think if the other European countries do start paying the membership fee, that Americans, and in particular the next American president, which could well be Donald Trump, would take a different view?
Yes, certainly. Even, you know, when Trump started complaining, it was 5 of 28 countries.
Yep.
And now it's, I think, 11 of 28.
11 or 12, yeah.
Yeah. And so there's at least some progress. I don't think there would have been progress unless Trump was you know, slapping in the face about it. So there is look, the United States loves Europe. Americans love to vacation in Europe. There's a cultural kinship. So it's not like America's looking to run away from Europe and leave it to its own, you know, leave it to the wolves. No, but fair is fair.
No, okay. Well, that point, I have to say I agree with that point 100%. Now, overnight, we learned that Illinois do not want Donald Trump to be on the ballot. Yet another legal case that needs to be appealed. Can he survive this sheer massive indictments piled up ahead of him?
He's in much better shape now than he even was 3 or 4 months ago. When you look at the nonsense of the Georgia prosecutor, Fani Willis, paying her lover $600,000 while he's coordinating with the White House and taking cash. I mean, the whole thing is really bad. The January 6th nonsense from the federal prosecutor, I believe, has been stayed or will be stayed by the Supreme Court until after the...
Well, January 6th, I mean, let's face it, January the 6th was pretty ugly.
It was a protest that got out of hand. It's not an insurrection, right? The relationship between the United States and Britain, 1775, that was an insurrection, and people showed up with guns that day.
They did, and they won.
And if they want to call January 6th an insurrection, not one firearms arrest in a country with 300 million personally owned firearms. So not fair to call it insurrection.
So Georgia was the most worrying of these cases, wasn't it?
And literally the prosecutor pretty much just dove on her pen set.
Does Trump win?
Will Trump win?
Yeah, will he win?
I think so. Yes.
Eric Prince, thanks for coming back on the programme.
Glad to be here.
Now, what the Farage moment. Lee Anderson, you know you made this speech about Sadiq Khan. Well, would you believe that the Metropolitan Police are now assessing whether a hate crime has been committed? Now, the problem with this is the all-party parliamentary group's definition of Islamophobia. And it is. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So if that was to be taken by the next Labour government and put into law, you almost finish up with a blasphemy law in this country. No, really, you get very close to a blasphemy law. We can slag off the Church of England, which I regularly do on this show because I can't stand the Archbishop. We can take the mickey out of the Pope. But if we were to say that we don't like Islam at all because of the way that it treats gay people, the way that it treats all over the world, where it runs states, the way that it treats women, we might find ourselves actually getting close to committing something akin to hate speech. And I think all of this, going back to the Equalities Act of 2010 and before, I think hate speech being in law is a mistake. The whole thing is subjective. And most of it's based on, if I take offence at what you say and say it was hate speech, well, then the authorities may well follow it up. This is all about individual group rights. It's all about identity politics. It's all, folks, a complete and utter disaster. The way forward, whether we're talking about prejudice against Jews, against Muslims, against people of colour, whatever it is, the way forward with all of this is to treat absolutely everybody exactly the same before the law. No fear, no favour for any groups. Treat everybody equally. And interestingly, you know, that great human rights leader, Martin Luther King, said that was exactly what he wanted. And yet, we're managing now through all of this to divide ourselves up. It is a mistake. In a moment, Rishi Sunak finally wakes up to the intimidation that has been going on Britain's streets and says the police now need to act to stamp it out. Late to the party, but what do the police need to do to stop these demonstrations?
Earlier on breakfast.
Now, it is the 29th of February, which means it's a leap year. Pip, you're going to be getting down on one knee today?
Absolutely not. I would only get down on one knee, as I said, Ellie, if it was to pick up my lipstick, which had fallen on the floor.
It's meant to be a deterrent. We don't really want people paying these fines at all. We want children to be in school. As I say, this is only for unauthorised absence.
I don't think it's sunk in for us.
No, it hasn't.
It's a bit overwhelming, but yeah, it's great. I think it's been going for 35 years now, the Fish and Chip Awards. To take it back to Wales, and it's only the third time it's ever come into Wales.
Yeah. Amazing.
It's an
So,
achievement
Ryan,
for us, we're proud of, yeah.
Every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Britain's newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
When you listen to Nigel Farage's assessment there, do you feel that maybe this is as good as it was going to get, given that we had the pandemic and it was inevitably always going to be a bit of a mixed bag?
Well, I think it's a bit of a poor excuse from Nigel there that they haven't done it properly. The facts are, Nigel, that it's not worked. It's not going to work. Yes, we will rejoin. I mean, are we better off for it? Are they...
Can I jump in there, Charlie? We're going to rejoin under which government? Because Labour aren't going to do that, unless you don't think...
But I mean, it's going to be unavoidable not to join, because I think it's getting worse and worse for us. I mean, let me just say this. Are the NHS better because we're out of Europe? No, they're not, because they're not employing more staff. Is the building trade better off? No. Is travelling abroad or to the EU or staying in the EU, are we better off? No. Are we better off because foods rise because of the EU? No. Are we better off with imports and export? No, because they're taking longer. The overall result is that we're not better off. The killer point here is 57% of the public would now vote to remain. 33% would leave. Surely that's the telling point.
It depends on the pollster, Charlie, because we were talking to a very good pollster earlier who said there's no enthusiasm for any change in a year. Maybe 10 years, they might be thinking about it.
Belinda de Lucia, let's bring you in. I'm sure you want to react to what Charlie said.
I mean, who would have thought that the UK wanting to run its own affairs and making our politicians more accountable would be so revolutionary? EU Parliament voted a majority to get rid of the vetoes, the last remaining scraps of democracy that the EU had. Now, luckily for EU citizens at the moment, you know, it means a treaty change to actually go forward. But that is the mood. The ever closer union. We have dodged a federalised, globalist, international, power-gobbling, anti-democratic organisation, and that's worth more than a few trade and travel perks for a few wealthy people in this country.
Hear, hear. Belinda de Lucia, Charlie Mullins, great to see you both.
I'm Andrew Doyle.
Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
One of the things that I found so extraordinary over the course of the last few weeks is the total inability of many of our parliamentarians and leading politicians to speak out clearly on what was happening. Whenever they talk about threats to MPs, they say, well, of course, there's the far right and there's the Islamist extremists. But actually, what has really been happening over the course of the last couple of weeks, and those abominable scenes that we saw in Parliament Square, the flashing up on the Elizabeth Tower that houses Big Ben off from the river to the sea, and folks, we know what that means. It's not just the abolition of Israel, it's the abolition of their people as well. What has stunned me about all of this is so few people have really spoken out. It's as if fear has been stalking the corridors of Westminster as sectarianism in British politics starts to become mainstream. And one of those who I think has been very slow to the party is the Prime Minister. But last night, he gave a speech to a Jewish group, so a predominantly Jewish audience, at which he said, and in a sense, this rather follows on from what Suella Braverman has been writing in the newspapers. He said, mob rule is replacing democratic rule. Well, too bloomin' right. Because it isn't just Parliament. We've seen council meetings where hordes of people come in. We saw a Conservative fundraising dinner last weekend in Stoke-on-Trent. And this level of intimidation from people who seem to have very little respect for the idea that we change things in this country by having a verbal punch-up. We then accept the result. And the whole thing has felt very intimidatory, and much of what has been said and chanted at the marches really very worrying. But he puts this down and says the police must shut down intimidatory protests. But what do you do if you're 150 police officers and there are 10,000 very angry people in front of you? How practically can this be done now that effectively the cat is out of the bag? I'm joined by Kevin Hurley, former Advanced Public Order Commander at the Metropolitan Police. Kevin, you know, of course, there have been criticisms of the police over the last few weeks that I personally believe are valid. How is it that nobody has been arrested for putting from the river to the sea on the Elizabeth Tower? How can the police have effectively turned a blind eye to that?
Well, there are all sorts of reasons. The first one is, at the very top, commanders are very, very scared, actually, to make the situation worse or to face criticism in any particular form. They certainly do not want, in this case, to be accused of being Islamophobic, as you've just discussed earlier on that programme. Actually, you made the good point, Nigel. How can you, with 150 people, deal with this? The fact of the matter is, the police require courts, they require prisons, they require probation to back them up if they make arrests. All of them have been cut and slashed, which effectively makes the police toothless when they come to make an arrest, because people walk out the door or they get a slap on the hand and that's the end of it. But when it comes to the practical elements of public order policing, the days have gone that we once had 20, 30, 40 years ago of putting large bodies of men up against groups of demonstrators, a bit of pushing and shoving, a bit of fisticuffs, and occasionally, in real terms, a baton flying through the air, to one now where we police totally different groups of people. Many of them come from other parts of the world where what we might call the traditional British policing techniques simply don't work. Many of the people you see on some of these demonstrations are used to being water cannons, sprayed with CS, or battened by their own police forces wherever they come from. So if we're realistic and we want the police to clear the streets and take them back, then we need to be talking about what we're seeing on the screen right now is water cannon. Because frankly, that's far less damaging, Nigel, than police officers battening people or kicking and punching them. And then we end up with those police officers being investigated years to come. And police officers actually don't want to do it anymore because they know they're going to be hung out to dry if they use excessive force. So why on earth would constables and sergeants want to get stuck in, as people call for it? And why would inspectors, chief inspectors, or indeed superintendents say, come on, let's get stuck in? They simply won't do it anymore. So we need to change the paradigm and look at what's being used elsewhere in the world.
And Kevin, for you personally, getting involved, dealing with public order offences, I guess, and we want our police officers to be brave, but they've also got to be realistic, haven't they, about what they can deal with at any one moment in time?
Yes, they have. And I mean, you're talking to someone who's led many baton charges, and I've struck many people with batons over the years, shouting stuff like, follow me or come with me to the people I'm in charge of. So I've done it. But there is a realistic situation, or you need to make an appraisal. Will you survive or will you be battered down if you go forward? But the other issue is, what about the investigations when you're captured on camera and your actions taken in maybe 5 seconds or 10 seconds out of context make it look like you're really dishing it out unnecessarily when you can't get the full, if you like, picture of what's been going on in the last half an hour. So we need to keep the police distant from the crowd now, which is why we need to bring in water cannon.
Okay.
And we need to look at using sprays with CS and stuff like that. Protect our officers and distance them from the crowd and drive the crowds back.
Water cannon in France, and we were showing some scenes whilst you were talking of the way demos in Paris are dealt with. Water cannons, though, don't stop protesters coming back, do they?
No, but what they do, they wash them away for that period in time, and they all run away. Now, you can add an irritant spray to that if you wish, which will stop them coming back, or you can actually put an index marker solution which shows up under ultraviolet light, so that as they disperse around the margins, you can then identify those who are present, match them up to the pictures, and then prosecute them for various public order offences.
Oh, I like the sound of that.
Bottom line, Nigel, if there are consequences, people think twice. So if you look at G4 or security vans these days, they've all got protected by smart water. And do you know what's happened? Armed robberies on cash-in-transit vans have all but stopped now, because people know that if you take the security box out, whoosh, you're covered in the spray, you can't get it off, it takes months to go, you can be identified and you get your time in prison.
Wow.
If we're serious, we need to be doing that and backing it up with court time and prison time. But of course, the prisons are full. So don't be
Kevin
surprised.
Hurley, I must say, I've enjoyed this chat enormously, because I was expecting you to say it's all really very, very difficult. But what you've actually done is offer some sensible, practical solutions that I think would carry overwhelming support in the country. Kevin Hurley, a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you. Now, it's my last show of the week. It's been a long week in America and here, and I'm looking forward to perhaps not being in front of you for a short period of time. But let's end the week with a very happy story, a Rees-Mogg story. But it's not about Jacob. No, it's about his son, Peter. And Jacob's going to tell us it now.
Well, you're very kind. It was in the Times today, this morning, that Peter was at a meeting with Matt Hancock. Matt Hancock was speaking and was disobliging about me.
At Eton College.
At Eton, even though he knew, I think, that at least one of my sons, in fact, 2 of them were in the meeting. So then comes to questions. Peter gets up and is very flattering about his father, very kind, and goes on to say that I'm loyal not only to the country, but to my wife. I think collapse of Stout Party at that point.
Absolutely love it. I think that's brilliant. Oh, gosh, folks, it sounds like there could be another Rees-Mogg in our public lives in the years to come. In a word or two, tonight's show.
Well, we're going to talk about non-doms and why they should not be got rid of, and this 1.4 million visas, immigration out of control as government policy.
Yeah, well, that was our main debate as well, wasn't it, this evening? When Rishi tells you he's about to get tough, it'll all be different next time if he's re-elected. It is becoming really very, very difficult to believe. Now, as you can see from my colour, the weather in Florida was magnificent. Is it going to be like that this weekend? Let's find out right now.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, Alex Burgill here with your latest GB News weather forecast. After a wet day in the southeast, that rain is going to clear away, and that will lead to a touch of frost in some places before a swathe of more heavy, persistent rain pushes into parts of the southwest through the early hours in association with a system that's currently feeding its way in from the Atlantic. Ahead of that, and like I said, there will be some clear skies allowing for some frost to develop, and we also need to watch out for some patches of fog and freezing fog first thing on Friday morning, and temperatures for many likely to drop close to, if not below freezing in a few prone rural spots. The most unsettled weather tomorrow morning will be across parts of the southwest and into Wales. Heavy rain here and also some snow over modest higher ground, likely to cause some disruption, particularly to travel. Also a little bit of flooding possible as well. That rain then feeds further north and eastwards, lying across northern parts of England as we head into the afternoon. A scattering of showers with some sunny spells developing across much of England and Wales. The best sunshine there across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Temperatures for many a little on the chilly side, especially when you consider tomorrow is the first day of meteorological spring. As we look towards Saturday, and it's a bit of a messy day, there will be some outbreaks of showery rain around, and there could still be some winteriness, particularly over any modest higher ground. At the moment, it looks like Sunday is going to be a dry day for many of us, but do watch out for some rain in the southeast and more wet weather to come as we go into the start of next week, particularly on Monday. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.